think I was inclined to believe that the murder was related to corruption in the church, that it was an inside job. I don't think there's a priest alive who isn't a sinner in some fashion.
It's really uncommon for a priest to be murdered, first of all. Second of all, for a priest to be murdered in such a brutal, violent fashion. Father Kunz was a very controversial figure. People loved him or hated him.
A good priest is going to also ruffle feathers because he's going to be like Christ.
Polarizing. Other people would use divisive.
What happened to this man and who did it?
For a lot of reasons, there are so many different suspects in his murder.
A charismatic Catholic priest was drawing people to the small community of Dane, Wisconsin in the 1990s. But then, the beloved priest was found murdered. I'm Paul Holes. This is Real Life Nightmare.
The call came in at 7 a.m. on March 4th, 1998. A man was down at St. Michael Catholic Church, lying in a pool of blood inside the school's hallway.
We were actually in the briefing for another homicide case when this one came in, and we were sent to go out to the scene. Another detective and I, Merle Ziegler, us were assigned, so we were the first two detectives on scene that morning.
The 911 caller said the man was 67-year-old Father Alfred Kunz, the parish priest.
To have a priest murdered inside a school in such a violent and bloody fashion shocked everyone.
Initially, it was quite a scene because you have the scene where you want to know what's going on, and then you have a lot of people that are arriving at that school and that church that day for what was going to be going on. And so there was just a lot of people that had to be isolated and interviewed. And then we had the neighborhood to start canvassing right away for anybody that saw or heard anything.
In 1998, Father Alfred Kunz had been pastor of the tiny St. Michael Church and School for 32 years. He was raised on Wisconsin farmland, not far from the village of Dane.
The community of Dane in the late 90s was small town, a lot of farmland, not a lot of crime. Most violent crime was domestic. And to have a murder of a priest was unheard of at that time, not only in Dane, but in all of Wisconsin and in much of the country.
Blood was everywhere, inside the hallway of the school. Cast off, an arterial spray was found on the lockers. Drops were found leading into the tiny apartment's bathroom. Some of Father Kunz's blood was brushed onto a doorframe, perhaps as the killer fled.
It was obvious by the condition of his body that he had been in a fight with this individual. His hands showed evidence of making contact.
Contact that would have left his assailant with noticeable injuries.
He had bruising on his hands that showed he probably got a few punches in. He had been, as a younger man, a Golden Gloves boxer. So even though he was small, he was strong and wiry and compact.
I don't know if he made contact with the person or lockers because those were right there, but he had some injuries, and he had some blunt force trauma to the head. None of those injuries would have killed him. Unfortunately, what took his life is his throat was slit. The weapon was not left. We have no idea what that weapon was, if they came with it, if they found it somewhere in the school and used it. But it was a significant weapon to do that kind of damage.
When now retired Dane County Detective Dawn Johnson first got to the scene on that March morning in 1998, she noticed Father Kunz's shoes next to his bloodied body. a key ring near his hand, and the radio blaring overhead.
You could hear the Christian radio program playing very loudly in the background. He was hard of hearing, so it was real loud. You could hear it out into the hallway. But other than that, the lights were off. His unit, his little place, the bedroom light was on, the bathroom light, I believe, was on. So it looked like he was getting ready for bed. It's very likely that he was either checking a noise or going to check the doors of the school one more time before he went to bed, make sure everything was secure.
Investigators first considered burglary a possible motive, even though nothing had been taken from the church that night, and there were no signs of forced entry. It appeared that whoever killed Father Kunz had a key to the building or was let in by the victim. The evening of his murder, Father Kunz had his best friend, Father Charles Fiore, with him for an interview with Catholic radio host Peter B. Kelly.
The last night of his life, we were at WEKZ FM radio studio. Father Kunz wanted his friend, Father Fiore, to tape with me a program about the Holy Eucharist.
He was picked up by Father Fiore at about 5 o'clock, and he was away for about 5 hours. He got back to the church and school area somewhere around 10 p.m. Father Fiore said goodbye to him. Father Kunz, we know from the scene that he went over to the White House. Now, the White House is like a rectory where the nuns used to be. Father Kunz had sent the nuns away and there weren't any more, so that house was vacant. So he used it for eating and watching TV, etc. So he had gone over there and he had prepared himself a Michelina microwavable noodle meal because that was on top of the trash. We also know, based on the timeline, that he had a telephone conversation with another priest, and that was somewhere around 10:20 p.m.
Sometime after 10:30, Father Kunz left this house, walked across an open yard, and entered the school through these double doors, walking down the hallway to get to his one-bedroom apartment. It appeared he was undressing for bed when he met his attacker.
Those investigating the violent and gruesome murder of this popular priest were about to learn some shocking things about him.
Father Kunz also did exorcisms.
It's one of those calls that anybody that picks up the phone and you hear a voice like Father Fiore said, "Peter, are you sitting down?" It gives you chills. And I said, "Yeah, Father, I'm sitting at my desk. What's up?" And he just said that Father Kunz was found dead this morning, murdered, in a pool of his own blood just outside the door of his apartment in his school.
To those who loved him, Father Alfred Kunz was a saint among men.
This is a guy who will baptize your baby, hear the baby's first confession, give him his first Holy Communion, make sure there's a school to educate him. He would counsel that young person when they're getting confirmed and getting engaged and getting married. He would be around to take care of those elderly people that needed the last rites and offer Street unction. He would bury them in the cemetery, and then he would still mow the grave.
But even among Catholics, Father Kunz had his critics.
Father Kunz was a very controversial figure. People loved him or hated him. There was absolutely no middle ground with him. He was incredibly polarizing to people.
Father Kunz even held a funeral mass for an aborted fetus.
I thought, isn't it remarkable that someone said, "What do we do, Father? Here is a little baby that was aborted." He said, "I'll tell you what we do. We give him a Catholic burial, a Catholic funeral mass." And they did. And they buried the child among the Fatima shrine right outside of St. Michael's.
In the 1960s, Vatican II ushered in a new, more modern approach to many of the Church's views and traditions. Delivering Mass in Latin, for example, with the priest's back turned toward the audience, was replaced with a Mass in English that allowed the priest to face the people. But Father Kunz didn't like changing tradition.
He was a unicorn, if you will, during those times. He had maintained this idea of, offering a reverent mass when all of us were doing the more casual thing. I think he stood out as really kind of a holy man during those times.
I think in the 1990s, it was a much more innocent time for the Catholic Church. It was before the priest sexual abuse scandal was brought to light by the Boston Globe. Families were more interested, I think, in maintaining that church community, especially in small towns. And so I think in Dane, part of Father Kunz's appeal was those traditional values. He was not going to bring the church into the modern times.
As a result, you have, even to this day, some who maybe recall him as being an ultra-conservative and harsh man, and yet others who regard him that he was in fact a very holy and compassionate priest.
Father Kunz also did exorcisms, and a lot of people don't know this, but the Catholic Church actually does sanction exorcisms. It's not just movies, but they have a few exorcists who are trained and who have very specific protocols about when you do an exorcism, when you don't, what the circumstances are, the support people you have to have around you. And Father Kunz didn't buy into any of that either, apparently, and he just kind of went off on his own and did solo exorcisms.
It's not something that anyone, priests included, are supposed to play with, if you will.
I'd be surprised that Father Kunz would attempt an exorcism without the permission of the local ordinary, the bishop. That just didn't seem to be, that wouldn't seem to me to be his style. Because, first of all, the devil will know that you're doing it illicitly without the permission of the bishop. And so I can't imagine he would ever do that. Father Kunz was too knowledgeable as a priest. I don't think he would do that.
As to whether it had any indirect connection to his murder, I guess you can't rule it out entirely.
Another one of Father Kunz's activities that he was not sanctioned by the church to take on was his own investigation into wrongdoing by other priests.
He had worked with an activist in Illinois who was determined to track down priests who had abused children. There was also talk of him having a list of priests who were child abusers, child molesters, and needed to be removed from the clergy. The rumor at the time was that he was going to, at some point, read this list on his radio show and expose all of this wrongdoing. Peter Kelly, the host of the show, said that was never the case. But a lot of people did believe that Father Kunz was on a mission to weed out pedophile priests.
He was an advisor to a group that was based in Illinois called Roman Catholic Faithful. And Roman Catholic Faithful was investigating some corruption in the Diocese of Springfield, Illinois. It was known that he was an advisor, although he was rather discreet about it, from my understanding.
Here's what I've come to understand in my 33 years of priesthood, is that when a person emphasizes things like reverence, and also he was big on exposing evil and trying to help us live in truth, those two things, reverence and truth, the devil hates those with a passion.
Parents have a serious obligation toward protecting their children from occasions of sin.
On the last night of his life, Father Kunz spent the evening with Peter B. Kelly and Father Charles Fiore. Father Kunz had been Kelly's regular co-host on Our Catholic Family radio show, but was handing the reins over to Father Fiore to take over.
And the last thing I remember of Father Kunz is his laughter from that gentle teasing by his friend Father Fiore as they left the radio station. And by the next morning, no one would ever hear that laughter again.
Father Fiore was the last known person to see Father Kunz alive. he drove Father Kunz back to St. Michael after the radio interview.
They were having a conversation, and then suddenly Father Kunz just grew very quiet. And Father Fiore said to him, "You know, you're a really good friend to me." And Father Kunz said, "I know." And then Father Fiore said, "I really love you." And Father Kunz said, "I know." And then they were quiet the rest of the drive home. And then Father Fiore dropped off Father Kunz, and within several hours he was dead in a puddle of blood in the school. Father Fiore was troubled by that conversation and Father Kunz's reactions to what had happened. And in hindsight, it made him wonder if Father Kunz had had some sort of feeling that maybe something was wrong or something bad was going to happen.
Father Kunz was dropped off at 10 p.m. At 7 the next morning, the first teacher to arrive for the school day found his body.
I think I was inclined to believe that the murder was related to corruption in the church, that it was an inside job. However, there also then was the theory of the teacher who discovered his body, who did have some disagreements with Father Kunz, or at least one that was known of.
The hardest part of this case is that the theories for what happened to this man and who did it, I've never had a case where there was so many possibilities. And that doesn't mean that Father Kunz was a bad man. It just means that he was involved in a lot of different things, so people could find a way to be angry enough to either confront him or silence him.
Father Alfred Kunz was killed by a single cut to his throat. He died just outside the door to his apartment inside St. Michael's School on March 4th, 1998, sparking the largest criminal investigation Dane County had ever seen. Investigators quickly learned that not all was well between Father Kunz and the church.
We looked at the church. Father Kunz was going through some stuff with the diocese. They weren't happy with him, and they wanted to move him. He was neglecting meetings, and he was doing things that the church was not happy with. At the same time, Father Kunz was arrogant, and he had a couple of conversations the week before his death where he said he wasn't worried about getting moved. That, yeah, they were trying to move him, but he wasn't worried. That he either had something on somebody or whatever, but he was not going to be moved. Whether Father Kunz was concerned that the church was going to be taking him out of there, or whether he had some sort of intuition that something was going to happen to him, he actually pulled together his altar boys and showed them things where things were kept, and showed him the sacristy and what goes on behind the altar, so that if he wasn't around, they would know where those things were, which I think is fascinating. So yes, I think it was very heightened at that point that he thought he was leaving, one way or the other, but I think at that point he was feeling that the church was going to pull him out dramatically.
One theory quickly crossed off the list of possible motives was any link between Father Kunz and inappropriate behavior with children.
That was really one that we could just eliminate almost right away. We had nobody complaining of how he treated children in a negative way like that. So that was good. But the bad news is that he may have had some adult relationships. And in more than one of those, that woman may have had another partner. So that may have created a problem.
I know there was a story of him befriending a server at a local diner that he went to quite often. She was a single mother, I believe. He was very kindly toward her. It said that, his behavior toward her was innocent, but he was a very friendly man.
The people I've talked to at the sheriff's department have said they spoke with these women, it happened, they believe them. However, since the allegations were sexual in nature, they wouldn't give me their names, and I wasn't able to figure out their names, so I couldn't talk to them firsthand.
But that certainly is another theory of, could it have been a crime of passion? Was it a real or perceived relationship that led to his murder?
Being the head of the church and school also meant that Father Kunz was responsible for the parish finances.
People would give him checks, and yeah, I'll get to it, but he never cashed it because he's so busy doing his priestly things.
When we went through that church, there was literally garbage bags of cash and checks that were never taken to the bank or cashed.
Father Kunz was, yes, known to be, I think, generous with his money. He did not necessarily keep a good watch over some of it.
There was money missing from the sacristy right before his murder, which was a big deal, a bag of checks and cash. Father Kunz was actively asking people about it. Where were you? What did you see? Where did you last see it? Who touched it? And he made a comment to somebody that he thinks he knows who took it. Is that the person that silenced him?
Investigators also know that sometimes the killer is the person who called 911.
Another reason why the teacher who found the body was a suspect in this homicide was because there was some friction between him and Father Kunz. He kind of chafed at some of Father Kunz's rules for his teachers. So not long before the murder, the teacher who found the body and another teacher had plans to go to the opera, and they were very excited. Father Kunz said no, they couldn't go. There was a Eucharistic Day celebration that same day, and the teachers were going to be expected to serve the meal. And so the teacher who found the body and his date were not happy and spent a long time on the phone complaining to each other about the fact that Father Kunz was making them do this. The argument with Father Kunz not too long before his death and the fact that he moved in with Father Fiore immediately after the murder both led the police to be pretty suspicious of the teacher who found the body.
I needed to talk to him personally, and I did. And after that interview, I felt very comfortable that he was not the suspect in this case. We also had a female that we looked at very closely that was a very unique individual, but she had a lot of information, and we ultimately did a search warrant on her home. The items that we were looking for weren't there. She had been seen in a military outfit that morning dropping her kids off at daycare. We had done an interview with her, and a knife was drawn by a child, and it was on the refrigerator, and it was a large military knife. And when I made a comment about the knife, this woman grabbed the picture and put it on top of the refrigerator. It was a large single-blade knife. But her military clothes were not at home when we did the search warrant. The knife that her son had seen, Mama's knife, was not at the house. The combat boots that she had her uniform tucked into was not at the house. And she lied about when those things were disposed of because we had witnesses that saw her in those clothing items. Once again, somebody that was never completely eliminated.
Detectives also looked into phone records.
Back then, we didn't have cell phones. Back then, telephones, just seeing who called, who were the last people that called him was nearly impossible to trace. We still have untraced calls that were made to him. He received a call that morning. In fact, it was right before Mass. He was late for Mass that morning because of the call. And whoever this person was upset Father Kunz, and he made it very clear he was not going to do whatever they were asking him to do. We have no idea who that person was.
Detective Don Johnson says what's missing from a crime scene can be as important as what's found.
One thing we didn't see is multiple stab wounds. And when somebody is angry, a lot of times you see them take out their anger by multiple stab wounds. So that was significant too, I think. I'm very concerned about a couple of different things still. There was also a person of interest that was near the church in the time that Father Kunz was murdered.
And people must understand that, so that let's just take a case of a contrite murderer, someone who has deliberately been guilty of homicide. He confesses this. He is intentionally sorry. The priest's lips are bound totally. He cannot in any way make reference to the fact that he heard the confession of a murderer on such and such a date or whatever, or in such and such a place. He must totally protect that with his life in any way.
He was very countercultural.
He was involved in exorcism.
People loved him or hated him.
Some might have considered him odd.
I don't think there's a priest alive who isn't a sinner in some fashion.
At least half a dozen fellow priests were looked at as potential suspects. There will be a criminal penalty for Father Kunz's killer if he or she is ever caught. But within the church, the killer may have already been forgiven.
I always say, I don't know how this works, God. But from what we're taught, obviously, murder is a grave sin. So if this soul didn't repent just before he died, or she, then it's likely that person is in eternal damnation. But think about it. That person may have lived 30 years longer and had all the time in the world to reach out to God and ask forgiveness. And God will forgive that person, and God will bring that person into heaven. That's the amazing part of our faith.
I think everybody is devastated that no one has been held accountable. And you know, one of the things that was very hard on us is we asked various priests that we interviewed, if somebody came to you and confessed, would you tell us? And the answer was no. Basically, they all said the same thing. We're going to tell them that they need to turn themselves in, but we can't force them to do that, and we won't share their confession. And I do believe there is somebody out there that probably did confess to this crime with their priest, and we're never going to know about it. That hurts.
This is one case retired Dane County Detective Dawn Johnson can't let go. She's been off the case for 2 decades, but it never leaves her mind. She's still trying to solve it.
I'm very concerned about a couple of different things still. The fact that no talk has ever come out. All the young kids that we talked to that we thought could potentially have been involved, a burglary interrupted, let's say, they all talk eventually, and nothing has ever leaked. So that seems to take away from that possible theme. The Catholic Church has always been very complicated. There's a lot of people there that he was involved with. There was a lot of people in the Catholic Church that were not fond of him. He was doing investigations and making waves, and etc. I don't know if we got full cooperation from the church completely. So I'm very concerned that somehow his silencing was related to the church. Satanic stuff was also looked into. You know, there was a calf that was murdered, mutilated, and not too far from the church, very close to the time of the murder.
The calf was killed the day before Father Kunz at a farm 15 miles from St. Michael Church. The farmer believed a cult was behind the killing.
That's very unusual. Once again, does that point to some sort of a ritualistic act to murder a calf, and why are you doing that? So it was just, again, something we had to look at and pursue, but we were never able to determine who did that.
But there's also the man whose story just doesn't add up.
There was also a person of interest that was near the church in the time zone that Father Kunz was murdered. he was there to confront Kunz about his potential wife-to-be and some things that were going on there.
The woman was receiving pre-marriage counseling from Father Kunz. She told investigators that Father Kunz had raised doubts about the suitability of the groom-to-be and suggested the woman not rush into marrying him. The man found out what Kunz had been telling the woman and was upset. He admits driving to the gas station across from St. Michael's late on March 3rd, deciding if he wanted to confront the priest.
He was up there at 11 o'clock at night, then claimed that he lost his nerve and decided to just go home. And that concerns me. That'll concern me forever, because at 11 o'clock, he probably would have seen Father Kunz at the White House, at the rectory. The lights were on. He probably would have even seen him go back to the church and the school. So I'm very concerned about that individual.
Nearly 2 decades passed with no movement in the case. Then, in 2018, investigators were able to uncover new evidence.
It's the only unsolved case of my career. I was a police officer for 28 years and now a private detective for 9 years. And even as a PI, I try to listen for any details that could go back to that. And since I have been a PI, I have called the task force twice to give them information about something they should look into or a name they should look up. I've been to Father Kunz's grave a couple of times to just say, boy, I wish you'd help us out, you know.
Whoever entered St. Michael's School on that fateful night in 1998 left the parish priest lying in a pool of his own blood, beaten, with a single cut to the throat. Investigators believe the killer is someone who knew Father Kunz and was familiar with the church property.
Anytime looking at a crime scene, first is understanding what is going on at the scene. So I have 2 photos that law enforcement has released that have blood patterns from the crime scene, and based on the droplets, I'm able to line these photos up almost 3-dimensionally. So these 2 photos inform me of this section of the crime scene. And what's notable about this limited information is that there are different blood patterns present. Of course, there's a large pool, presumably from the throat cut. There's also other smaller droplets, as well as that are striking the floor straight on, as well as droplets that have a fair amount of velocity to them, striking the floor at an extremely low angle. I have larger blood drops that have struck the lockers at an angle, and they're on their course of possibly arcing downwards. What's very telling, again, going back to Father Kunz's victimology, he was a boxer. And so, of course, he's going to resort to that skill set during an attack, and his hand is showing bruises. There is no question that he, in all likelihood, has struck his attacker multiple times. This bruising is most consistent with the attacker being struck in the face or the head. That's the hard object. This is where, when I initially look at this, my first question is, were swabs collected of his hand? Because if he's hit the attacker in the mouth, in the nose, there's DNA being transferred. The attacker walked away injured. And now this really elevates the possibility that there's attacker DNA somewhere within this crime scene. Either bleeding injuries, contact DNA with Father Kunz and his clothing that he had on at the time, saliva that has transferred during a fight, so much potential. So even with the limited information that I have of this crime scene, I can see where this has the possibility of being a solvable case with modern technology.
In 2018, which was the 20th anniversary of Father Kunz's murder, They did a big push and put out press releases and put out a lot of information on Facebook about the crime and the fact that it was still unsolved, and they were looking for tips and looking for people to come forward.
And it worked. Suddenly, Dane County Sheriff's Office was flooded with calls.
Some people did come forward during that push, and for 4 months, they had several people full-time working on the Father Kunz case again.
But by 2018, there had also been incredible advances in scientific testing of evidence.
The Dane County Sheriff's Office was able to go back and retest some of the evidence for DNA. And they found a new DNA profile that did not match any of the known suspects. So any of the people that they had been looking at for the first 20 years of this case, they tested this partial DNA sample against all of them, and it didn't match any of them. The other issue with this new DNA profile is that it was only a partial profile.
DNA testing also cleared the teacher who found the body and called 911.
In order to put a DNA profile into the national and international databases, you need a full and complete profile, and then you can try to get a hit for an unknown suspect. If you only have a partial profile, you have to find the suspect first and then see if the DNA matches up with what you found at the crime scene. So it might help at some point proving a case, but it can't help solve the case. I think the way Father Kunz is remembered depends on who's doing the remembering. I think that he had a lot of close friends and parishioners who remember him as almost a saintly figure, someone who did everything he could to try and bring this flawed world back to morality and back to Jesus, and someone who was helping make Dane a better and more sacred place. I think for the vast majority of people, Father Kunz is going to be remembered only as the victim of this grisly and unsolved murder.
The power in the church certainly played a role in making this a difficult case. There's no doubt about that. As far as the power goes, there was just so much secrecy more than power in here. The things that he was involved in or what the church wasn't thrilled with him on, there was a lot of secrecy. I don't think we got all the information about that. I think we've only scratched the surface, but I don't think we're ever going to get that information.
We have been misled by TV dramas where they can do it in an hour with technology. Because I'm sure there are very good people working that case and have been for literally decades now. And they've collected all the evidence they could collect. And they still can't find out who, much less why. And that's troubling to me.
You know, I think the sheriff's office seems to think that there is someone out there, at least one person, maybe more, that does know what happened to Father Kunz, and for any host of reasons has not come forward yet, has not talked to them and said what transpired. That's very possible. And I do think, yes, there are certain people or a certain person who I'm sure knows more than he or she has been willing to say for whatever reason.
Way back when, there was a psychic that contacted us, as I'm sure they do on all homicide cases. She said we weren't going to solve it for a really long time, which when you're hearing it then, you're like, oh, I hope she's not right. But she said we're going to solve it. So I have to keep that faith, not just because of her, but I have to keep the faith that technology and faith, we will solve this case. It's going to happen. Why is it taking so long? There's a reason. I don't know what it is, but we're going to solve it.
Do you think his murder will be solved here on Earth?
I don't know. It's been so long, and they don't seem to be making any headway. One hopes that there's some kind of whistleblower that would emerge or anything. I'm kind of hoping that we're in a period right now in our church in the world where a lot of things are getting exposed. And so the corruption and the crime and the evil that's seems to have erupted all around us will come crashing down. So maybe we're in the time of, some people call it illumination. And actually in sacred scripture, God talks about that he will bring evil to its knees and shine a light on it. So I'm hopeful.
I don't think they would tell you it's a cold case. I don't think they would tell you that it's on the back burner at all. But at a certain point in an investigation, you reach a point where there's really not a lot else you can do with the information that you have. And so I think at this point, rather than actively investigating, they're waiting for someone to come forward.
If you have information about the murder of Father Alfred Kunz, call the Dane County Sheriff's Office at 608-284-6900. I'm Paul Holes. This is Real Life Nightmare.
God gives you the grace to live your marriage just for today. That is the ongoing grace of the sacrament of this mystery. And that is what you share in, and that is what we pray for you about this morning.
I remember the moment when it sunk in that somebody had stolen my child.
It was, always the bigger cities that had this kind of trouble.
She walked her normal route down the street and gone.
How could that happen in that short distance where everybody knows everybody in a small town?
It's just amazing what a split second can do.
Somebody out there knows what happened. The person that did this is still out there.
Just one little break and they can solve this.
The truth always comes out.
Cleary, Washington is a small town, just over 2 square miles. A place where parents don't worry about their kids playing outside. It's just a short walk home from a friend's house on a hot summer night. 10-year-old Lindsay Baum has less than a half mile to go to get home, down quiet residential streets, across one of the main roads in town, and past a gas station. It usually takes her about 10 minutes. I'm Paul Holes. This is Real Life Nightmare.
I thought it was a safe little quiet town.
Well, Clary's like a lot of the East County towns in Grace Harbor County, 16, 17, 1,800 people.
It's partway between Olympia and the ocean. I mean, it really has a sense that this is a friendly town. This is a nice place to live.
I had just separated from my ex-husband a few months before we moved to McCleary. And I was having trouble with daycare. So we moved to McCleary because one of my oldest friends said, well, I can watch your kids before and after school, but you have to move out here.
It's just, I would say, a quiet, comfortable place to raise kids. It's just a quiet place to be.
I remember as I came down the hill into town thinking, this is such a cute little town.
I mean, it was a little town, still is. Kids ran around, everybody watched over everybody's children, people didn't lock their doors.
McCleary became home for the Baum family. Mom, Melissa, son, Josh, 12, and Lindsay, who was 10 years old. Like a lot of preteens in 2009, Lindsay is crazy about a young adult book series set right there in the Pacific Northwest.
Twilight was her big thing at the time.
I On your left.
She was very into movies. She had become an 80s movie buff, which I, of course, loved because she was falling in love with all my old favorites. She'd gotten a hold of some of my old VHS tapes, and I think Dream a Little Dream was probably her favorite, that or The Lost Boys.
In McClary, Lindsay and her friends are a regular sight around town.
I talked to the ladies at the main store here in town, and they said, yeah, she used to come in quite a bit. And that's how it was with that little group.
Used to say she came out of the womb talking. And that was really the only thing she ever got in trouble in school for, was talking. She was quite the little chatterbox.
You saw her little group of kids walking around town, and I would look out the gas station out my department window, and there she'd be walking across the street with her friends. You know, it was not uncommon to see her in the area. My daughter did that too at that age.
June 26, 2009. What's a fun summer night? Time to go out and play.
Hot. It was a really hot day that day. It was kind of off the record hot that year. She had been hanging out with her friends. One of the other girls in town that lived just up the street from us had a pool in their backyard. They spent the day there swimming. They came back and forth to my house several times, but most of the day they were hanging out over there and swimming and just enjoying being out of school. They wanted Michaela to stay with us. She had stayed the night before, so their plan was they were going to go down to Michaela's to get some clothes because they thought she was going to stay the night with us again.
She went with her brother Josh, and for some reason they got into a tiff, and he ended up going back home.
For whatever reason, once they got to Michaela's house, Michaela was told no. They were going somewhere the next day or something, so she wasn't able to. Lindsay headed home alone.
Here in the Northwest, the sun just does not set until way late. So even 9 o'clock, the sun's still high in the sky, and it starts to get towards dusk as you get towards 10 o'clock. But in the summertime, kids are out running around. People are out mowing their yards late at night because it's still sunny.
She never left her cell phone, ever, except for that night. She had left it on the charger, and she usually took our German Shepherd. But that night she didn't. They were in a hurry because she wanted to get back before dark. They were just going to go down, get Michaela's clothes, and come straight back. She should have been back in 20 minutes tops.
It's a relatively straight shot from where she was to her home. McClary's a small town, so it was 8 to 10 blocks exactly to her house.
She always came home when she was supposed to. She checked in like she was supposed to. She had a cell phone. So if I couldn't find her, I'd call her. But she was always home, before dark. I always knew where she was. I kept calling Lindsay's cell phone, and at that point I hadn't realized it was in her bedroom, plugged in. And so I kept calling her, like, Lindsay, hurry up and get home. Where are you at?
Once it got dark, after 10 o'clock, that's when things got serious, and Melissa decided it was time to call the McClary Police Department.
That's when I really started to panic because I knew she wouldn't just be out after dark. That just wasn't her. She didn't like to be outside after dark. So I knew at that point something wasn't right.
School had just let out for the summer, and it was unseasonably hot, crazy hot for McClary for that time of year.
For Lindsay, this was a chance to go be with her friends.
She'd just finished the 5th grade. She was just having fun hanging out with her friends.
Lindsay and her friend Michaela have a plan for the evening.
Went to Michaela's house to see if she can do a sleepover. She went with her brother Josh, and for some reason they got into a tiff, and he ended up going back home.
When they got to her friend's residence, they said, "Nah, the sleepover's not a good idea." At about 9:30, it was starting to get dusk. It was still light, but they said, Lindsay knew she needed to get home, so she left and was headed to her residence. The officer working the shift that night was told that Lindsay Baum hadn't come home and that she was last seen at a friend's house. He began looking around, talked to the mom, and then checking the local areas where kids would go.
Melissa had, by that point, had already called everybody in Lindsay's cell phone contact list. Nobody had seen her since she left the friend's house.
Right away, we tried to do the Amber Alert. And unfortunately, I guess there's criteria that you need for the Amber Alert, and we didn't have that, a vehicle, what she was wearing at the time. And so we could not do an Amber Alert. So we continued to, call in other people to help us, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
The McCleary police searched through the night, contacted the Grace Harbor County Sheriff's Office for additional manpower. And from there, it just grew exponentially and very quickly as to the number of agencies and people involved trying to find her.
It set in that this is highly unusual because by then we'd already checked all the normal places that she would be. Was it parental interference? Did she run away because I guess her and her brother got in an argument and she didn't want to be around him or something. So we thought, well, maybe she's just a runaway, she's hiding. And then it got where nobody knew where she was. And this is just not right.
Lindsay didn't have a cell phone, she didn't have any money, she had no way to really facilitate her own disappearance. So we didn't think it was a runaway situation, we didn't think she was hiding.
It was going through my mind like, it's fine, she's gonna show up, like stuff like this doesn't happen here, and it was very surreal. It was several hours before it really dawned on me that somebody had taken my child. I think that initially popped in my head, and I just kept pushing it away, and thinking, oh man, when she gets here, I'm gonna wear her out and lock her in her room for a year. I tried not to jump to conclusions right away, but what are you supposed to do? She wouldn't have been out after dark. I knew that for a fact.
We didn't have any major crimes. It was, always the bigger cities that had this kind of trouble. I always pushed for 5 officers, but I believe at the time we had 4. It's a small community with a small police budget.
In the early morning hours of Saturday, they still hadn't found her. And so I told them to arrange for some search and rescue resources to be activated at daylight on Saturday if she hadn't been found by then, and to use those resources to assist in searching the community. Like I said, McCleary is a small community. At the time, it had right around 1,000 to 1,500 people living in it, and wasn't that large geographically, so figured we could search it pretty effectively with some search and rescue volunteers.
Almost immediately after that, the FBI was there, and so we knew, oh no, this means it's not good news. This is now serious.
McCleary is a pretty small agency. Grays Harbor County Sheriff is also relatively small. What we essentially bring is manpower and resources. We've got specialists in the field of child abductions. We have behavioral analysts. We have CAST, which is our cell phone analysis agents who are specialized in digital and social media and cell phone analysis. We have planes, we have drones, we have evidence response teams. Basically, we have any kind of specialty that you need to investigate any kind of crime. We can provide somebody who can provide that resource to a local agency.
We had missing children's organizations coming in. We had the sheriff going through the jail getting volunteers to go out, inmates. And they went out and they did a good job. A brushy area, they took it down to the soil. And with all the searches done, very little evidence that we could see. It just like she just disappeared at her halfway point from home.
Everybody was looking at everybody else, looking at family members, looking at friends.
Lindsay was on a walk that was pretty finite, right in her own neighborhood. She just disappeared into thin air. You have a pretty finite group of suspects.
Really, the first few days, especially probably the first few weeks, are such a fog to me. They were just kind of looking at everybody at that point. They were doing roadblocks and passing out flyers and, doing door to door. It was chaos.
Somebody had to see something. It was a hot day. Everybody's out probably on their front porches in McClary just trying to cool off. Not a lot of AC in East County, Grace Harbor, so.
If you were in McClary between 9 and 10 o'clock on that night, we wanted to talk to you. We wanted to know what you saw, who you saw, vehicles you saw, what you were doing. If you were out for a walk, if you were letting the dog out, it didn't matter. And that's why we were doing those door-to-door canvassing, to find out, were you home that night?
Neighbors were looking at neighbors, so here's this friendly town where now it's like, did you have something to do with this, or do you know somebody? The town had taken a turn. It was no longer the friendly Mayberry. It was a town now where a girl had disappeared and they don't know who did it, how it happened.
Stranger abductions are very, very rare. We were looking at everything. We reached out to her father and spoke with him. He lives in the Tennessee area.
Please, just bring my daughter home. Give us a peace of mind. Let her go unharmed. Thank you.
We talked to anybody and everybody that was out and about that day that we could find. We talked to the kids, we talked to her friends, we talked to kids that she went to school with that weren't even there. We interviewed her teachers. We were talking to anybody that might have information that could possibly give us an indication as to what had happened. Everyone knew who Lindsay was. At that time in 2009, she was somebody who was part of the local kids that played in the park, and so the teachers knew her, the coaches knew her, the business owners knew her. And we talked to her mom extensively, we talked to her brother extensively, all of her friends, any extended family, just to see if there was any conversations that they had with her, any concerns that Lindsay would have expressed to anybody about anything were something that we wanted to know about. We spent a lot of time getting to know the family and talking to them about all of those things, and then again just talking to her friends and teachers and all of those people just to see if she had anything that she was concerned about, any new people in her life, new friends that she had, knew somebody that might have approached her and tried to befriend her.
She hadn't been communicating with anyone that they were able to find.
One of the first things we did was look at how many registered sex offenders lived in the community, and then I expanded that out 5 miles, and then 5 miles to 10 miles, and then of course when you get out 20 miles, well, now you're incorporating the city of Olympia that is a much, much larger population, and so we were building this huge database that could be mined for information to see who talked to who and when we talked to them and who was out and about. But we didn't have that one nugget that was going to unravel this.
The focus was on basically everybody in town. And all the way back to, in fact, Melissa Baum. Everybody was looking at her, whether she had something to do with it or was careless in letting her be out there.
At first it devastated me. I'd find myself arguing with people and feeling the need to defend myself. And it really hurt me, a lot of the things that people said. Like, apparently I was a drug addict and I sold Lindsay for a drug debt. Well, anybody that's ever known me knows that I have never in my life done drugs, but it still hurt me, and I always felt like I needed to defend it. I did take a polygraph test. I didn't want them wasting time on me. I knew that I'd be the one they'd be looking at, and I had nothing to hide. I opened up my entire world to them. They had the logins to my online accounts, to my email. They had access to my phones. I let them into everything.
I know that Melissa, for a time, people were talking about how she was raising feral kids and how just let them run amok and loose, and there's really no truth to that. It's not unusual for kids to walk through town by themselves.
There's all the eyes on you, like all the neighbors. They know you. They know your kids, and they might say to your child, "Get on home," Have you called your mom? But it's not the kind of place where you'd think that she would be snatched up by someone in a car, that she would be pulled into a house, that she would be a target of a pedophile. Those are the kinds of things that would be the farthest thing from your mind in a little town like McCleary.
Big rumor was the dust-up between Lindsay and her brother over a bicycle the night she disappeared. And there was a lot of gossip about, well, you know, maybe it was the brother, which again, there was nothing to any of that.
My son got the worst of it. You know, I could deal with what came at me a lot better than what came at him. A lot of people accused him of being the one that did it and that I was covering up. And that devastated him in so many ways. And it didn't help that he has the autism. And he harbored guilt anyways because he'd been mad at her and he left to come home. And he felt like if they hadn't been fighting, he would have been with her and she would have been safe. I've always told him if somebody really wanted her, they would have hurt him too, just to get her.
A lot of rumors, but on the other hand, you tend to focus on the negative sometimes. But when Lindsay went missing, I think the thing to focus on is just how the community as a whole came together to find her. People from McCleary and out, way outside heard about Lindsay's disappearance and just showed up in town and just said, hey, how can I help? What can I do?
We paired up local detectives with FBI agents, and then they worked in tandem to try to knock on every door in McCleary, talk to every person, to walk the route that we believe she would have been on to go from her friend's house to her home, and then see what there was in the way of any kind of camera surveillance, both privately and public, businesses, to try to identify and develop persons of interest, and at the same time, see if we can't come up with a witness or some idea of what happened.
There are all kinds of theories that perhaps it was a stranger that drove through. But the fact of the matter is, it's several blocks off the main highway, so you would have to really take a detour to be on the road that she was on. And so when they talk about who did this, it really leads to, they believe that it might have been somebody that Lindsay would have known, somebody from the town. Even though, as we see in her smiling face, she was very friendly, but she wasn't careless. So she wouldn't have gotten into a car, they don't believe, of a stranger's.
Obviously, Ring doorbells weren't in existence in 2009. The availability of CCTV footage just wasn't there.
A business at the busy intersection along Lindsay's route home did have cameras.
It's just a short walk home from a friend's house on a hot summer night. 10-year-old Lindsay Baum has less than a half mile to go to get home. Down quiet residential streets, across one of the main roads in town, and past a gas station. It usually takes her about 10 minutes.
Did you find any witnesses who had seen her walking along that path?
We found two. One lady who was getting home from work, and another that was just passing through the area, that were almost certain that they saw her. The description they gave matched her description, and the point that they saw Lindsay was within a block or so of Maple and 4th Street.
The halfway point, that was it. It was like nothing from that point on.
They figured she walked her normal route down the street and gone.
There was really nothing at all to go on. They had search dogs come out and tracked her a certain distance, but they didn't find any indication of her, of Lindsay, as far as, maybe an article of clothing or hair, anything. It was pretty eerie how there seemed to be no trace of her whatsoever once she left her friend's house.
At the point she was last seen, Lindsay was almost to a busy intersection with a gas station on the corner. A gas station with video cameras inside and out. There's no video of Lindsay. However, investigators want to identify everyone else captured on camera.
If you came in and bought something, if you got gas, if you were a customer in any way, shape, or form, if you just stopped in to say hi to the clerk because that was your friend, we just wanted to talk to those people because you would have been obviously out and about at that period of time that we're really focused on, that we're still focused on. And so we were able to identify almost everyone because, again, small town, everybody knows everybody, to walk the route that we believe she would have been on to go from her friend's house to her home, and then see what there was in the way of any kind of camera surveillance, both privately and public, businesses, all of those things that you see law enforcement do to try to see if we can't come up with a witness or some idea of what happened. The goal was to take a snapshot of the city of McClary as though you were hovering over it that night at 9:30 and see who was out, what cars were in the area, who was driving around.
One local man is under scrutiny after he's seen on video at a local market, despite telling police he'd been out of town.
He told me he doesn't know what happened to Lindsay. He doesn't remember being there. And he said, if they have proof that I was there, I'm not going to dispute that.
Some of those things, came down to people just human nature, not wanting to be involved, or some people honestly didn't remember that they had done that. They said, God, I did run to the store. Now I totally forgot about it, but I did.
If you're there and you say you're somewhere else, somebody's going to find that out. And for whatever reason, one young man was right on that path as well that Lindsay would have taken, and he said, he was somewhere else. They looked at several people that just flat out lied about where they were that night, and that puts you on the A list of people that they need to run down and check out. They've been through several yards, they've had helicopter searches, they've been through ponds, and still no firm suspect as yet.
To this day, though, there's a car and a person with a boy that walked into the store at the Shell station that was right at the time that we were and are focused on. We've never identified. There was a gray Honda Ridgeline pickup truck that came into the Shell station right about the time we were interested, and there was a man and a young boy that came in. We don't know whether they had anything to do with the Honda Ridgeline pickup, and we don't know who they are. We were able to identify everybody else and actually have conversations with them, but those remain unknown.
It never made any sense to me how she could have been snatched in the middle of town and nobody saw anything. So in my mind to this day, I feel like it had to have been somebody she either knew or thought she could trust.
When we look at a missing child investigation, especially the age of when Lindsay was taken, what her age was, we typically think it's sexual in nature, and oftentimes these individuals who do take children of that age, they're looking to satisfy their need as quickly as possible.
I told them I wanted them to take the city and turn it upside down and shake it and see what they could find. We took the main cell tower that services that area so that we could look at subscriber information for those numbers. We went to the gas stations and the businesses that were open and got all the credit card receipts from that night. We talked to anybody and everybody that we could think of and looked at all the data that we could get that would show who was in and around McClary at that time.
We got a tip that these people saw Lindsay Baum in the back of a car, and we had units flying down the highway doing over 100 miles an hour trying to intercept this vehicle, and we finally did, and I believe one of the deputies came up and told me, he says, Chief, this was a psychic. I felt all kind of different things, anger. I mean, I just put 8 officers' lives in danger on the highway, and we were intercepting, and no one told me this was from a psychic.
A man said that a friend of his told him that he ran over a girl walking on the street, and that he took the body, put it in his vehicle, and drove out to the ocean and put the body in a crab pot and threw it out off of Westport and Ocean Shores. A couple of years, a year later, they found a skull in a crab pot, and they believed it was a young child.
It took a long time before we were able to finally find the source of the original story. He admitted that he made the whole thing up and that he did it to get back at somebody he thought had done him wrong. And the remains were identified as human, but they were an adult, and it was from long ago based on the aging of the remains.
About a year after Lindsay is reported missing, 130 miles away in Portland, Oregon, 7-year-old Kyron Horman disappears after his elementary school science fair on June 4th, 2010.
Ages were comparable, the circumstances were similar, genders were different, but my detectives and the detectives with the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office in Portland, Oregon area all worked together. And the FBI agents that were assigned to that case and the FBI agents that were assigned to our case, I mean, there was a lot of dialogue because of the similarities in those two cases. Both of them continued to occasionally have conversation with one another to see where things are going.
We've done extensive study and extensive research on the typical subject of somebody who would take a girl of that age. Typically what it fits is, I believe over 70% of those individuals are male, and typically they're white male individuals. 70% of them or so have a criminal history, prior convictions for possible breaking and entering, any kind of sexual deviancy in the past as well. Oftentimes these guys are on the fringe of society socially, have issues with interacting with other adults, and they have other sexual fantasies that cause them to want to eventually actually commit the crimes.
It was long days. Myself and a number of other officers worked 45, 50 days in a row with no time off. And the average officer was putting in anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day. And I was having to tell people to go home to take a break just to regenerate because we were wearing people out. And everyone became so invested in the investigation. And as time wore on, it becomes personal.
Lindsay's mother is fighting her own battle to keep her daughter's case in the public eye.
She was there organizing, and so even though the pain of losing a child, where sometimes you might be recluse and go into seclusion, she was out front and center.
I know she's alive, but I need her home. Somebody that tells me I'm better off not knowing has never been in my position. I want to know. I want to know what happened to my daughter. I want to know who did it. And until I get that, I'm not going to let it drop. Somebody's going to pay for what happened to my daughter.
She had a lot of questions about what she could actually do herself to push along the investigation. Rose Winquist, who's my investigator, and has been for decades, has been working with law enforcement. And she also has the capacity to do a lot more mapping of suspects, comparing different information, social media searches, all kinds of searches on individuals, comparing information on people's alibis, comparing different statements. I mean, she can do things that the law enforcement agency like Grays Harbor, which is a pretty depressed county, may not have the time or the manpower to accomplish.
There's a lot of people that don't want anything to do with law enforcement. Those are going to be the ones that would rather talk to Rose.
In 2017, there's a disturbing case in Seattle about 80 miles away that may have a connection to Lindsay's disappearance.
Seattle police investigators returned to the home of 3 elderly brothers, Edwin, Thomas, and Charlie Emery, all charged with possession of child pornography. Further south in Shelton, at a home of a deceased 4th brother, there was a startling find.
A clue found inside may be connected to the disappearance of Lindsay Baum.
They found a flyer, the missing person flyer of Lindsay Baum. And so they were looked at very seriously. And when you think if indeed she was abducted, a kindly older man might be something that would break through the ice of, a cautious Lindsey Baum.
Charges are dropped against the eldest brother, Charles Emery, who has dementia and is determined to be unable to aid in his own defense. The two remaining brothers pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree child pornography charges. None of the brothers are charged in connection to the Baum case.
At the end of the day, there was no evidence to link them to this investigation.
The detective on the case called me at work. I knew something was up.
I got word that there was a press conference to update the Baum case. I didn't know what it was about.
I had completely convinced myself that she was going to come home. It is the most lonely feeling that you could ever imagine, to not know where your child is. I think any parent that's ever lost their kid in the grocery store or the mall in that horror, that feeling never goes away when somebody steals your child. That can't breathe, panicked feeling is 24/7.
On May 10th, 2018, the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Department calls a news conference about the Lindsey Baum case, almost 9 years after Lindsey's disappearance. It's not just members of the media, but also local residents who show up at the McClary Community Center to hear the announcement.
I'm here today to share with you that we've brought Lindsey home. We've recovered her. Sadly, she was not recovered as we and her family had hoped and prayed these last 9 years.
There was hope right up to the point where there was no longer reason for hope. You could feel the oxygen get sucked out of the room. You hear gasps from some of the people. It was pretty devastating, even though after all those years, not surprising, but still upsetting to everybody who held out hope.
I thought, damn, who could do that? You know, what kind of person?
Her remains were recovered in September of 2017, unknowingly, by some hunters in a remote portion of eastern Washington. Those remains were turned over to local authorities, who in turn released them to the FBI, where they were confirmed to be human, and sent to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, for analysis for DNA. Because the remains were not associated with a specific criminal investigation, they were not analyzed for DNA until just recently. So just in the recent week were we notified that the DNA collected from the remains matched the DNA submitted to the lab in 2009.
The remains were found in a steep, heavily wooded area in Kittitas County.
The remains were obviously skeletal. It was just the remains of the skull that were found, and so that's what was submitted to the lab.
This is how much remains I got back of Lindsey. 2 of these, one for me and one for my son. I do have a little urn, but these were filled. So everything on there says unknown. It doesn't have a date of death. It has a found date, and it has cause of death, homicidal violence. Everything else is unknown. They have her place of death is Kittitas County, but that's only because that's where her remains were found. I don't think she died in Kittitas County. But other than that, every single box on her death certificate says unknown.
There were some searches, some pretty intensive searches done shortly after they were identified. But steep, hilly area, a lot of snow in the wintertime, a lot of runoff in the springtime. They don't know where that tiny bit of remains would have originated from. They have no idea. That's another frustrating part for investigators is, how did she get here? Where's the rest of the remains?
It's remote. It's only visited by hunters, hikers, cross-country skiers. It's not off the main road. It is deep in the woods. And so, you know, if you connect this person in McClary and who knows how to hunt, who knows how to hike, who goes up into the woods, that's your person.
This took the innocence away from the city of McClary. I mean, it was a little town, still is. It was the little town where everybody knew everybody. Kids ran around, everybody watched over everybody's children. People didn't lock their doors. I mean, it was a little town with a very small police agency that was very innocent.
If you drive through McClary to this day, you will see a lot of signs and banners throughout the town with pictures of Lindsay.
This is an investigation that really has become one of those cases where you talk about it every day. Young detectives that I've newly promoted, one of the first things they're told to do is to go through this case, to look at all the different things that have occurred with fresh eyes.
We have a mountain of information that we compiled at the beginning of this investigation. Times have changed. Over the last 10, 12 years, we have developed further investigative techniques that we try to revisit the information that was attained at the time of the actual abduction, and we look at it with fresh eyes, through fresh technology, and through fresh information.
The person that did this is still out there, and somebody has an idea or a feeling or that gut sense that someone, whether it's a friend, a relative, a neighbor, a coworker, somebody that they've crossed paths within their life, they're thinking might have something to do with this. And so those are the people that we asked to come forward.
Just one little break and they can solve this.
It could just be the smallest thing that could fit all the pieces together. But if you've got the answers that a family's waiting for, why would you not report that?
There are bad people out there, you know, I hate to say that, but there's some evil going on out there. And for someone to take a young child like that and who knows what she might have gone through, is those people need to be found.
Do you allow yourself to think about what Lindsay would be doing now?
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time I think about it. I think about what would you look like today? What would you be doing? Would you have started vet school now? Would you have kids now? Would you be married? I think about it all the time. An entire future was taken. It wasn't just a 10-year-old's life. It was her future. It was my future. It was my son's future. They stole that from all of us. And Lindsay would have made her mark on the world. She was a go-getter.
Lindsay Baum's murder is still unsolved, and there is an active reward for information leading to an arrest. I'm Paul Holes. This is Real Life Nightmare.
这应该是跟这背景画，我都应该坐中间来啊。谢谢喵明，谢谢喵明的幽默。车多少钱？60块钱往返，大家没？哎，咱家有40级的哥们儿喊个喇叭吗？随滨看大海，或者滨发秦皇岛，帮我喊个喇叭行吗？40级大哥喊个分区喇叭。
Wonder if I could bring them to live. I could bring my lover. And baby, you make me wait. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Welcome you back there again. Play the music back there again. I saw the looking out of the window. Wonder if I could bring them down. I could bring my love now, baby. You make
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my simple, gave my friends a helping hand. I bet you know that